If you've been following this channel for a while, you'd know I've made a decent handful of videos discussing the topic of crossovers and guest characters, the unexpected meetups which have the tendency to excite and bewilder people by mashing together two or more things that might share a fan base. However, these meetups aren't as simple as that description may sound, as for every crossover that's come around, there's just as many that fall through, either because they can't get the IP owner on board, the rights to the series is just overly complicated, or they just weren't able to get a deal sorted out due to poor timing. So how about we take a look at these unlikely meetups that, for one reason or another, were just not meant to be, and what exactly caused them to be scrapped. These are the crossovers that almost happened. Let's start things off with our only game today that isn't a fighter, with Marvel Ultimate Alliance, an action RPG made by Raven Software and published by Activision that released in 2006 for near enough every major platform at the time. The game seeing the various heroes of Marvel Comics working together to stop the Masters of Evil, a legion of supervillains led by Doctor Doom, with all but the GBA version of the title utilizing a similar style of gameplay to Ravensoft's previous Marvel output with the X-Men Legends games. It overall receiving praise both for the gameplay itself and just how many characters were featured in the title, clearly showcasing the developers' love for the comics, eventually leading to a sequel in 2009 which was primarily based on the crossover event Civil War. Now, whilst the lineup of Marvel heroes and villains featured in the title is already impressive as is, there were actually plans to bring in a couple more heroes from other franchises at some point. Specifically, Activision had an idea that as an exclusive bonus for the Wii version of the title, you could unlock both Link from The Legend of Zelda and Metroid Samus as playable characters, with some early test footage of the two eventually finding their way online. Unfortunately, Nintendo turned down the idea, though we've never been given an official explanation as to why exactly they said no. The most commonly spread theory being that they might have been offended due to the characters being showcased in an alpha build of the PS2 version of the title. Funnily enough though, whilst this crossover never went through, this isn't actually the last time Nintendo would be associated with the series, as a decade after the release of Ultimate Alliance 2, a third game in the series released in 2019, telling an original story loosely based on the Infinity Gauntlet event, which not only saw development duties being handed over to Team Ninja, but released as an exclusive for the Switch owing to the fact that Nintendo was the game's publisher, meaning they went from denying a crossover to funding the series revival, in turn adding Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 to the long list of games you probably didn't realize Nintendo had any involvement with. Kind of funny how things can come around full circle like that, almost as if it's just one big wheel of fate. As mentioned before, the rest of this video is basically going to be nothing but fighting games, so what better way to ease ourselves into that than with the series that's arguably leaned the heaviest on crossovers in recent times with Mortal Kombat, where after initially testing the waters with Kratos and Freddy Krueger in MK9, every entry going forwards would dedicate about half of its DLC slots to guest characters, pulling from a mix of comics as well as classic horror and action movies. Now, the game we want to focus on in particular is 2019's Mortal Kombat 11, which actually had its initial DLC lineup leak early in April after data miners dug around in the files for the Switch port, which suggested that the guests this time around would consist of Image Comics' Spawn, DC's The Joker, the T-800 Terminator, and Evil Dead's Ash Williams, with the excitement only being amped further when the leak leak was undoubtedly verified when the following month in May, at the end of the gameplay trailer for the first DLC fighter, Shang Tsung, they not only outright confirmed Spawn's inclusion, but the ending teaser for two other characters seemed to be suggesting Ash based on the chainsaw noise, and the T-800 from the ending musical sting that sounds very similar to the Terminator theme. However, when the official reveal trailer for the Kombat pack dropped, whilst the T-800 was there, not only was the Joker featured instead of Ash, but he also looked noticeably worse than every other character featured, which only became more confusing when the first in-game ads for the season pass mentioned Ash, not Joker, all of which seemed to suggest that Ash was supposed to be part of the Kombat pack, but was then swapped out for Joker at the last minute. Whilst this led to some disappointment that he'd been potentially dropped, an email in 2020 once again mentioned Ash in the copyright notice, specifically name-dropping the third film in the series, Army of Darkness. So when a trailer dropped in May for the game's story DLC, Aftermath, people tuned in and saw 3 more characters were going to be added, namely the other 2 MK characters in the league that hadn't been added yet, with Fujin and Shiva, and 1 more guest character who turned out to be RoboCop. And when Aftermath released later that month, all of Ash's files were removed from the game, with Ed Boon himself even stepping in to deconfirm any rumors he'd be added in the final DLC pack, which instead used its guest slot to add Rambo. So what exactly happened here that caused Ash to go from being planned as one of the first guest characters for the game to the franchise lead having to go out of his way to confirm he wasn't going to be added? Well, based on what happened, as well as various comments made by Ash Williams' actor, Bruce Campbell, the most likely answer seems to just be that the rights to Ash, and by extension the Evil Dead franchise, are a legal nightmare, owing to the fact that near enough every production in the series' history is owned by a different company, the original film trilogy alone having the rights split between director Sam Raimi, Studio Canal, and MGM, with the difficulties of trying to sort these issues being why he was pushed back and swapped with Joker initially, and whilst based on the email they seem to have at least gotten MGM on board, the whole thing was likely just taking way too much time and they just couldn't get everyone to sign off on it, eventually leading them to just drop the idea completely. Since then, there hasn't been any signs that the MK team want to try this again. NetherRealm finding out that the scariest thing about the Evil Dead isn't the Necronomicon or the various demons it summons, but the idea of trying to get 3 or more companies to agree to a deal in order to actually utilize anything from the series. Let's take a step up from guest characters in fighting games to guest characters in crossover fighting games with Street Fighter Cross Tekken, the 2012 mashup of Capcom and Namco's iconic button mashers, which owing to a mix of its ham-fisted gem system, on-disc DLC, and frankly terrible Pandora mechanic, is widely regarded as one of the fighting games of all time. Now, ignoring all those issues I've just mentioned, one other thing people took umbrage with was how the PlayStation versions of the game got 5 exclusive guest characters, the lineup consisting of Cole McGrath, the main protagonist of the first 2 infamous games, Toro Inoue and Koro, the cartoon cats from Dokodemo Isio that are often considered to be PlayStation's mascots in Japan, Pac-Man in a Mokujin-themed mech, and a rendition of Mega Man inspired by the first game's famously terrible American box art. The overall reaction to the news was a mix of general confusion due to no one outside Japan knowing who Toro and Kuro were, some outrage over Mega Man's inclusion being unintentionally viewed as a harsh jab against the series after several titles had been cancelled and it started being generally ignored by the company, and some disappointment over the fact that Xbox 360 and PC players had effectively been left empty-handed. That last point, however, was not originally the case, as in addition to community director Seth Killian confirming confirming at one point they considered Uncharted's Nathan Drake for the game before dropping him in favor of Cole, Yoshinori Ono, the lead producer of Street Fighters 4, 5, and Cross Tekken, revealed they had actually been in talks with Microsoft to include some guest fighters for the Xbox 360 version of the game, with two in particular they had an interest in adding, being Halo's Master Chief and Marcus Phoenix from Gears of War, but apparently due to timing issues and other unspecified problems, they just weren't able to arrange a deal to include anyone, hence why PlayStation was the only platform to get exclusive characters. So essentially, Xbox players got less characters because either Microsoft or Capcom just completely fumbled and left Sony with all the exclusive fighters by complete accident. Although given Mega Man's ability to fly away from the match and win via timeouts, maybe this was an unintentional blessing. So, where can we go after guessing a crossover fighter? Well, how about not one, but two crossover fighters getting cancelled and resulting in what is commonly viewed as one of the worst fighting games Capcom has ever made. Our story starts with the Capcom vs SNK series, a duology of team-based fighting games which saw two of the biggest names in the arcade scene coming together, both of which are widely beloved and considered to be some of the best fighting games of all time, naturally meaning that Capcom had more than a vested interest in doing a third entry in the series, which they decided to go all out on by shifting to a full-blown 3D fighter similar to the Street Fighter EX series. However, plans for Capcom vs SNK 3 would ultimately be dropped when just a few months after CVS 2 released, SNK went bankrupt, and seemingly Capcom didn't have a vested interest in continuing development on a crossover with a dead company, with the closest we've gone to seeing a CVS 3 being when Playmore, the company created by the original founder of SNK that bought up all of their assets following the studio's closure, would make their own spin on the idea with 2003's SNK vs Capcom SBC Chaos, which saw an overall mixed reaction. Not wanting their efforts to go to waste, the game was quickly reworked to instead be a solely Capcom crossover, titled Capcom Fighting All-Stars Code Holder. The story seeing a terrorist called Death threatening to blow up Metro City with a small nuke that can only be disarmed via a series of codes held by three of his underlings, named Dee, Luke, and Ingrid, with the roster consisting of characters pulled from Street Fighter, Final Fight, Darkstalkers, Rival Schools, and Strider, along with the four original characters and one guest from SNK, the exact identity of whom remains unknown, but based on a silhouette that was shown as part of a retrospective for the game on the Street Fighter V website, most people seem to think it would have been either Kyo Kusanagi or K-Dash from the King of Fighters series. Unfortunately, this game would also end up being cancelled, after some small-scale tests for the arcade version of the game resulted in mostly negative feedback, along with just the lack of interest in arcade and fighting games amongst Capcom staff at the time, most of them having moved on to working on console franchises like Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, and Devil May Cry, resulting in All-Stars being viewed as a project that wasn't shaping up to be very good, and people within the company didn't really care that much about. Despite this though, Capcom still wanted to see something come out of the game they had spent money on and effectively cancelled twice. So with the budget of basically nothing, they told a team to just make something out of what had already been done, and to do it as cheaply as possible. The end result being 2004's Capcom Fighting Jam, or Capcom Fighting Evolution in America, which basically just directly ripped characters from Darkstalkers 3, Red Earth, as well as Street Fighters 2 out Alpha 3 and Third Strike, slapped them together with no regard for how their different combat systems and mechanics would lead to certain characters being completely useless due to the fact that they just can't do the same basic mechanics that other characters can, or how they would have completely different art styles that don't mesh together at all, with stage backgrounds that are mostly just pictures of real places with random character artwork slapped on top, and arcade endings that are just slow pans of comic book panels with no dialogue or text, altogether resulting in what is commonly viewed as the worst fighting game Capcom had ever made since Street Fighter 1, especially when you consider it was coming out around the same time as titles like Tekken 5, Virtua Fighter 4 Final Tuned, Mortal Kombat Deception, and Dead or Alive Ultimate, almost acting as the perfect showcase as to how little Capcom cared for fighting games at this point, something that would remain true until 2008 with the release and subsequent popularity of Street Fighter 4. Whilst it's unlikely we'll see CVS3 or Fighting All-Stars as they were initially envisioned, in addition to Capcom and SNK reuniting to re-release their various crossover titles, along with Street Fighter and Fatal Fury including guest DLC spots for each other, there is one remnant of All-Stars that's managed to stick around even to this day, as one of the original characters for the game, Ingrid, would actually end up being included in Fighting Jam as the only fighter specifically made for the game, with her then going on to appear in both Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max, the PSP version of the final game in the Alpha series, where she was added as a non-canon bonus character, as well as Project Cross Zone 2, a tactical RPG featuring characters pulled from various Capcom, Namco, and Sega franchises. And after some small cameo appearances in Street Fighter 5, she's currently set to make her proper debut in the series as part of Street Fighter 6's third season of DLC. So despite the disappointment inflicted by Fighting Jam, the spirit for Fighting All-Stars and the hope of a potential Capcom vs SNK 3 still live on to this day, even if not in the way we or the developers behind them originally thought. Gonna end things off here for now, but I hope that with that ending remark, you can at least take home to never give up on your dreams, cause there's always the chance it will work out and come real in the end. And also that the worst pain you can possibly inflict in someone is trying to negotiate the legal rights to a film franchise.